One of the things about savings groups is that they've already done the outreach effort. So they've reached out to some of the most vulnerable women in rural communities, and they've organized them in ways that make it easy to interact with them. They also, when you look at other development issues, whether it's access to healthcare, whether it's increasing productivity in agriculture, often one of the underlying issues is around women's access to and control of resources. And savings groups have already addressed those issues. So they've already helped women save up and gather resources, so they have access to kind of larger pools of funds and more assets than they might have otherwise. It's also increased their control over those assets because they've been able to put it in the group. They're able to manage how that spend is. They're able to borrow from the group when they need it. So they're able to control the assets as well as kind of build the assets over time. Yeah, absolutely. I think the savings group movement is though interestingly it started in West Africa, it's actually much larger and more entrenched in East Africa. And you've seen a lot more innovation in the East African markets, looking at how you take traditional savings groups and look at linking them into formal financial services, but also how you link them into, for example, the country of Tanzania had a large HIV/AIDS awareness program that was based on and kind of layered on top of the savings group movement, because so many people in Tanzania were part of that movement. And most of the countries in West Africa are still kind of catching up in terms of that kind of large scale outreach of the savings group movements. And they're also catching up in terms of some of the innovations around linking it with other programs. So particularly some of the innovations around linking it with access to formal financial services, linking it with digital technology. I think one of the other things that's unique between East and West Africa are some of the gender issues, particularly, and those are the things we've been talking about this week. In West Africa, particularly in a lot of the Francophone West African countries and the northern West African countries, you see significant issues around women's mobility, around women's control of resources, and so those dynamics play out quite differently than in the savings groups. Savings groups become very safe spaces for women to start to deal with money inside their community rather than having to go outside the community. So they address some of the mobility challenges that women have. In East Africa, women have different empowerment issues, but mobility and kind of access to mobility in particular is not as much of an issue in East Africa. East Africa has a lot of issues around gender-based violence, and the savings groups can provide safe spaces for women to talk about and start to address some of those. In West Africa, we work on access to finance primarily through savings groups and through linkages of those savings groups with formal financial actors. So, for example, with funding from UNCDF in the microloan program in Burkina Faso, we're working with savings groups and with credit cooperatives and with a microfinance institution. We also work in markets like Ghana in looking at agricultural finance. So not working through savings groups, but working through producer cooperatives and looking at addressing access to finance issues for smallholder farmers. Well, I think UNCDF, through the microloan program and others, have made significant contributions really to moving the thinking forward on savings groups. There's been a lot of work, there's a lot of investment these days in the linking of the savings groups with the formal financial institutions. I think some of the areas where UNCDF and others could be thinking about are digitization of the savings groups, how we can use the information that's held in savings groups to start to develop credit histories for women, which are so important going forward in financial inclusion. But also, given what we've seen in East Africa about how successful the scaling up of the savings groups have been, but also understanding that the funding for the kind of creation of savings groups is coming down. What are some innovative models we can look at using social networking or using some of these other technologies to make that replication of the savings groups more viral?